Welcome again, everyone. My name is Brian Balicki, your host of the podcast, The Juice is Worth the Squeeze. Embrace it. It's my life story of 55 plus years as a type 1 diabetic and still counting. This is the fourth episode of Season 1. It's titled One Violent Night, One Fateful Night. Thanks to all of you who've taken the time to connect with my prior podcasts. The podcasts are now distributed on all major distribution outlets, including Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and iHeart. I should point out the video versions of all podcasts have been and will continue to be broadcast on YouTube under Brian Balicki, The Juice. Yes, just type those words in the search box, Brian Balicki, The Juice, at YouTube, and the video versions of all of the above should appear there. You may have noticed I've chosen to distribute two versions of each of my prior podcasts that I've created. First is a simple audio podcast, and a second companion version is in multimedia format. The multimedia version appears only at YouTube under my title, Brian Balicki, The Juice. The audio podcasts are accessible at Amazon, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, and even a few other boutique-like directories. Content-wise, there really is no difference, only the packaging differs. I chose this approach because I felt the multimedia format that adds some visuals, graphics, and video footage is more engaging than simply listening to an audio format. It's also best suited for learning, understanding, and retaining certain important details of my lifelong experiences as a type 1 diabetic. You might think of the multimedia version as having the same purpose a movie does, following the release of my upcoming book. Until that happens, the audio and multimedia podcasts will combine to hopefully achieve the same purpose. Now, a quick summary of podcasts to date. I'm happy to say they've been downloaded in 4 countries to date, including here in the United States from coast to coast, and they are growing in circulation. More than 100 downloads across all these platforms in little more than a month's time has happened. I'm truly grateful for this, and also that my life story appears to have some relevance and meaning to diabetics, their families, and caregivers around the globe. I also want to thank you for your comments as well. Please keep them coming. After today's podcast, please go to, quote, fanlist.com/the juice and leave your feedback there. Again, that's fanlist.com/the juice. Today's podcast harkens back to the summer of 1968, to the very beginnings of my 55-plus year journey as a type 1 diabetic. My beginning was a rough one, and I'm not even talking about the immediate period after being hospitalized and diagnosed with type 1. Yes, that was a challenging period for sure, but it wasn't the most traumatic. Today's podcast reviews the actual events of one day in June 1968 that set in motion the metabolic changes I believe that led my pancreas to literally stop working later in the fall of that year. My broadcast today is neither violent nor graphic, but on one day in June 1968, my life was. After listening to today's podcast, I think you'll find the opening scene of my lifetime journey was very different from most, if not virtually all, experiences of type 1s. Despite some very brutal moments at the beginning of my 55-plus year journey, I've been able to achieve a healthy, enjoyable, meaningful, and drama-free lifestyle at age 71. I believe it's proof this is possible for all type 1 diabetics after a lifetime of simple, what I believe to be reasonable control of the disease. I want to begin today by talking briefly about 2 overlapping trends in 1968 that I believe accounted for the dramatic beginning to my 55-plus year journey. One was national, and a second more specific to my life growing up on the northwest side of Chicago. As things turned out, both were highly related, chaotic, violent, and fateful. Nationally at that time, social unrest was a daily news narrative throughout the country in 1968. If you were to visit the U.S.'s National Archives, and recount the events of 1968, you'll find the headline for that year went something like this: 1968, a year of turmoil and change. Those were their words, not mine. That title could just as easily summarize much of my personal life in 1968. Just for some context, Martin Luther King was assassinated that year. Robert Kennedy Jr. was gunned down by an assassin in a Los Angeles hotel exactly 1 week before the weekend I will talk about shortly that disrupted my life forever. There were riots in Washington, D.C., Detroit, and other major cities, including Chicago in 1968. Much of this was rooted in the reactions to the Vietnam War by young people and the declining social conditions in poor urban communities across the country. In summer of 1968, Chicago took center stage in the daily media reports of youth protests, confrontations with authorities, and disorders in city streets. An impending national political convention in Chicago was like a magnet for protesters and disorders in downtown Chicago. At that time, few could escape or ignore the reports of youth and confrontations with the authorities, police carrying billy clubs, National Guardsmen in full combat gear, called in to squelch college protesters, sometimes even spraying youth with mace, using water hoses, and even engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Yes, bloodied faces of young people were commonly broadcast on local and national TV, being arrested or carried away because they were so badly beaten they could barely walk. These memories are still vivid for me and for countless others who lived in the city at that time. Myself and my circle of 15-year-old teenage friends were never participants in any of those events that year. Never in a million years would we have ever put ourselves in a position to be physically exposed to that. We were actually pretty insulated from it, or at least we thought we were. We might have been casual consumers of the news, but never directly involved in it. Thankfully, my friends and I were still too young to be persuaded or caught up in the prevailing tensions, social unrest, and violence that played out in cities and college campuses nationwide. I say all of this because it's important to the story I'm about to tell. Social attitudes were changing fast about the young people who were protesting in those days. Rightfully or wrongfully, protesters increasingly became viewed as troublemakers, bratty, privileged, mischievous, and even deserving of some of the punishment they received just because they were disorderly. My point is, my friends and I were nowhere close to being as extreme or intentional as the protesters. But our looks, our social habits, our meanderings about our neighborhood sometimes made us guilty by what I call emulation. Like it or not, we were at risk of becoming collateral damage and targets of what I call street bullying. This was not the playground variety of bullying that we might have experienced in our elementary school ground playlots. No, this bullying behavior was meant to be physical, intimidating, and even brutal. At the time, it seemed like it was becoming increasingly common for young people generally to be roughed up, to be taught a lesson, basically, if you will, for being too public, too sympathetic, and even just looking too much like the protesters engaged in the national disorders. On the northwest side of Chicago, this bullying was done by a small local group of neighborhood males, slightly older than us. Why, you might ask? They simply did not like what my friends and I looked like, our haircuts or lack thereof, how we dressed, where we hung out, and how we mingled as friends when we were together. Whether we liked it or not, their perceptions put us in the unenviable position of being associated with the protesters. Outwardly, yes, I would agree some might say my friends and I stood out, but the bully crowd, or as we called them, the greasers, simply didn't like this. The greasers probably felt that we, like protesters of that time, were deserving of some discipline, and for some ridiculous reason, they also felt they were the enforcers in the neighborhood, a self-appointed group of vigilantes who thought that they might keep the order in the neighborhood, if and when the local police were not available to respond to any of our imagined misbehaviors. Unknowingly, we became their targets, not really understanding how much they really disliked us. However, in summer 1968, we quickly became savvy enough to be wary of and avoid, if at all possible, random encounters with the greaser crowd. We knew if these confrontations did happen, the greasers might choose to make us very uncomfortable. In their minds, meetings with us might end with them challenging us to demonstrate just how masculine or physical we could be. On the second weekend of June, Saturday, June 15th to be exact, my friends and I simply, let our guard down. It was an evening spent with Billy and Mike, two close friends of mine. I was very close with Billy, a friend going back to my earliest boyhood days. We shared many good times in local sports stuff and recreation, carousing around and just simply hanging out in the neighborhood. Along with other friends, we played most every sport imaginable. Baseball at the local Steinman's High School campus, fast pitch and rubber baseball at Mary Lyon Public School, alley basketball, ice skating, and hockey at the local Reese Park. Sometimes even played on streets in front of our homes when Chicago winter temperatures by chance left ice and snow on the neighborhood streets. Later, we skated and played hockey at indoor venues like Ridgeland Commons and Rainbow Arena. Those were special, big league-like venues we enjoyed sparingly later. We played touch football in the streets and tackle football at Steinmetz, an 18-hole golf course at Jackson Park, and other special places. Mike was close to me, but he was mostly a seasonal kind of friend because he was more locked in on basketball. Well, on that Saturday evening, we just happened to have some extra bucks in our pockets. Coincidentally, it happened that most of us just completed a week or two of work on our first real jobs. That weekend arrived with our much-anticipated first paychecks of the summer. In retrospect, it was an evening eerily similar to the Hollywood movie West Side Story. Yes, the one with gangs of sharks and jets, having certain styles of dress that defined who we were. In our younger days, my friends and I sometimes playfully reenacted scenes from that very same movie. Billy's older sister, Linda, loved the movie. We kidded Linda occasionally that she resembled Maria, played by Natalie Wood at the time, albeit Linda was a bit more edgy and quick with her sense of humor. Billy's older brother was virtually a mirror image of George Shakiris, physically sculpted, clean-cut, and in simple terms, just macho. In my younger days, my friend Billy often led us in random moments walking the neighborhoods and having fun as kids. We reenacted dance scenes of sharks and gents, much like flash mob-like moments we see in social media today. In 1968, we had no social media, no iPads, no cell phones, nothing to capture times of our lives. As Paul Anka, an actor and pop singer of that time, would later popularize in a song with that same name, a few years later in Kodak TV commercials. June 15 turned out to be a day with a more serious staging of West Side Story. Completely unplanned, random, and unexpected. Ironically, the west side of Chicago, 3,000 north and 6,200 west, to be exact, provided the setting. Luckily, it did not end with grave consequences for Billy and Mike. For me, though, I might have avoided the gravity, but not the brutality of that night. Billy, Mike, and I were nothing like the rough and tough shark gang in West Side Story. Come to think of it, neither did we dress or even behave as either gang in that movie, the other being the Jets. Before leaving for that night out, I remember we briefly discussed how we might dress. How duper-like did we want to be? You might ask, what did duper-like mean? In a word, the Beach Boys. It was a West Coast look, a peaceful, passive summertime look, as identified by our cut-off jeans, penny loafers, and lighter-colored garb. This was very different than the customary look of the local greasers, the local bullies. The greaser look came right out of West Side Story, however. Baggy gray pants, black pointed shoes, white tees with bare shoulders, and slick back hair. The differences between us and them were like night and day. While us dupers were very visibly different from greasers, that night we actually wanted to avoid drawing too much attention to ourselves. We toned down our West Coast look a bit to mesh with our larger circle of duper friends we expected to meet later that night. In hindsight, that probably was a bad decision. But honestly, today, I don't think even toning down our look any further would have led to any different outcome of events. We simply ended up landing at the wrong place at a bad time. We left around 6:30 p.m. that evening with lots of sunlight. We had to be back home by 11 o'clock, curfew time in those days. Our first stop was the local soda fountain, the Dairy Bar, on the corner of Belmont and Austin, roughly a half mile to 3/4 miles from our houses. It was a quaint hangout, known for its cherry sodas, snack shelves, and friendly atmosphere. Mind you, there was no Facebook, TikTok, or social media to help us connect with friends back in that day. If you wanted to hang out with friends, it was always a good bet you could find someone to do that at the Dairy Bar. That night we bought sodas, snacks, and hung out by chance with some friends at the Dairy Bar, just simply savoring the sweetness of summer. Like most random get-togethers in those days, there was the usual joking and clowning around, and some friendly muscling around each other as well. We simply exchanged stories and plans for the summer months that lie ahead of us. As the evening unfolded, my friends and I began our walk home. It was around 9:30 p.m. that night when we found ourselves approaching the intersection of Berry and Melvina at the northeast corner of Steinmetz campus beneath the soft glow of street lighting. Steinmetz High School actually was our field of dreams. Yes, we did and played everything at Steinmetz in our younger years. Baseball, touch and tackle football, and golf. Steinmetz campus also had a 1/4-inch mile track. Many families, like my own, found it to be the best place to help young kids learn how to ride their first new small bikes, or to test out later upgrades. As younger teams, we sometimes used that track for bicycle races also, to stage Olympic-like group relay races. That was truly fun. Among its many uses, Steinmetz campus was a meeting place the prior summer when my friends and I were getting in shape for the sophomore football team at our high school, St. Patrick. I remember our school coaches, Mr. Cummings and Mr. Hester, gave us a very detailed written program of the physical conditioning we were expected to follow prior to trying out for the team in the fall of 1967. The most challenging part of that program was being able to complete a mile-long run in full football equipment under 6 minutes. Steinmetz was the only venue in our neighborhood where we could actually practice that test. It meant running around Steinmetz track 4 times in summer-like temperatures. Yes, the Steinmetz track was the proving ground to help us meet that goal. And we actually did. Steinmetz campus always felt very welcoming and friendly. As kids, many summers we actually brought our parents' old bladed push lawnmower cutters to the campus and its overgrown grass to literally carve out our own versions of Fields of Dreams. We did it to mark off the silhouettes of a major league-like baseball diamond. We mowed grass to define an infield, a pitching circle, baselines, and outfield foul lines. Yes, we did that to create our own Fields of Dreams, long before a movie was ever staged on the big screen. But it wasn't just Steinmetz High School that was our field of dreams. The surrounding neighborhood was also. It was a special setting to all of us, me included, for all the fun times we enjoyed there as kids. For me, the Saturday evening, June 15, at Steinmetz campus would be remembered, however, for another very different reason. As we approached the campus that night, we had a quick decision to make. In our duper-like clothes, we paused to ask ourselves, should we cross the dark and grass field of the campus or walk the sidewalks that formed a perimeter around it? If we crossed the grassy campus, that was a shorter, direct 5-minute walk at most to my house. The sidewalk was a slightly longer route back home. It might add another 5 to 10 minutes. We felt it might be safer, though, because the sidewalks were lighted by street lamps. But this route also had some risk. Because it was lighted, we in our duper guard would be clearly visible to any passing cars or neighborhood residents. Obviously, this path might call attention to us. But since there were resident homes along the campus, we felt we still would be within a doorbell knock or ring of getting help if any trouble arose. The shorter option, directly crossing the dark campus field, would only give us pseudo cover, a false sense of security. Why? It clearly had us from street lamp lighting. However, once we stepped onto the campus, our silhouette still might be seen against the lamp-lighted streets surrounding the campus. On top of this, we were always wary there might be some local greaser guys, possibly lying low in the unmowed tall grass, lurking for some trouble. Little did we know that fate had something else in store for us on that summer night before we ever could make a decision. We never began what we thought would be a leisurely walk home. Billy and Mike reached the corner of Berry and Melvina when the street lamp lighting slowly and fully revealed us entering the intersection. Our voices may have been audible to nearby houses in that moment and their residents who might have been sitting outside, but we consciously tried to keep our voices subdued. What followed was a chance encounter with someone from the past, well, from my past at least, an acquaintance from my earlier boyhood baseball days on the Steinmetz campus. We noticed a hot-looking new gold Dodge Rambler near the intersection. It was truly a unique car in that time, in that moment, on that day in the neighborhood. There was only one person who drove such a car in our neighborhood. Upon seeing the car initially, I thought it was strange that that car was parked near the intersection on that night. I knew where that car should have been parked, and it was definitely not at that intersection. I had seen it numerous times on the other side of the campus 2 blocks away. I saw it almost every time I walked back and forth from my house on Merrimack to pick up some last-minute groceries at the corner store on Diversey and Merrimack. Coors was the name of that store. The gold Dodge Rambler belonged to Ricky P., and it was always parked there, 3 city blocks away on the other side of the campus, not in the no parking zone at Berry and Melvina that night. We were all surprised and suspicious. Why? Other than being parked illegally, the car did not even appear to have any occupants, and its motor was silent. This was very strange. It seemed like the car was planted there, waiting for us. However, as we moved closer to the intersection, we did notice some motion in the car. The overhead dome light lit up inside of it. The doors slowly opened. As I suspected, it could only be one of 2 people who might step out of the driver's side of the Dodge Rambler, either Ricky P. or his older brother. I was not familiar with Ricky's older brother because he never played pickup baseball games on the campus with us as kids. However, I remembered Ricky vividly, a smallish kid, sort of stocky, with a very noticeable chipped front tooth. Occasionally, Ricky played pickup baseball games with my older brother and his friends. Sometimes my friends and I were added to teams of older guys when we played them. Occasionally, the older guys, like my brother, needed some fillers on those days when they were short of players. I happened to be nearby, and oftentimes I was a good filler. But my skills were no match to those of my older brother and his friends. I just simply got to be on the field with them, playing against some tough competition. The memories were numerous and proved to be telling. For me, one of those was the chipped front tooth of Ricky, one of the local guys, later turned greaser that I just happened to share the field with a few times back in the day. He stuck in my mind, though, because his slightly disfigured front tooth and his on-the-field smoking habits were so different from the other guys, I could never forget him. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect to be reminded, much less confronted by Ricky and his friends, that night during the walk home. As the 2 doors of the gold Rambler opened, tension in the air grew immediately and was palpable. 5 guys, led by Ricky, they rolled out of the car and approached the intersection. My social antennae were quickly activated. Outwardly, the three of us, Billy, Mike, and I, all younger than Ricky's gang, all we wanted to do was to appear calm, but it did not take long for our internal alarm bells to start ringing. Inwardly, I suspected we were outmanned, spooked, and literally effed. It felt like one of those random encounters we feared, and we tried to avoid at all costs that might end up with a face-to-face encounter with a gang of local greasers. While walking toward us, we overheard some mumbles by Ricky and his gang. They appeared to be looking for a house and an address in the neighborhood, and they appeared lost. This turned out to be nothing more than a ruse. The gang of the gang of five approached us. There were only three of us. They mumbled an address and asked if we knew of it. We mumbled back. But then, strangely, they asked us if we had any pocket change. Ricky walked directly toward me. Even though it was dark, I noticed Ricky's chipped tooth and raspy smoker's voice while he was talking. Foolish me, unlike Billy and Mike, I continued to approach the intersection and the gang. I put my head down and reached down into my pockets for some loose coin. In that moment, chaos broke out. Ricky struck me across the face, knocked me down, and with a couple of more face jabs. Other gang members quickly jumped in to deliver some more jabs and repeatedly kicked me in the ribs. The incident maybe spanned 2 or 3 minutes, but that's all I remember to this day. Might have been longer, but since I was beaten pretty badly, I remember very little else. Billy and Mike, luckily, were more street savvy than I in that moment. They sensed the gang members were drunk and held back. Once the physical scuffle began, they scattered. I did not have time to break away. Billy and Mike were chased, but the commotion, noises, and shouting of the street fight appeared to cause Ricky and his gang to quickly slip back into their Dodge Rambler and sped away. Following this ambush, fortunately, I was somehow able to physically pick myself up. I remember struggling to walk to a corner house looking for some help. Not realizing how badly hurt I was and how I physically appeared, I quickly caught a glimpse of my bloodied face in the brand new, clear, pristine glass storm door of the house on the corner. I suspect I looked like one of those bloodied faces of protesters beaten by the local police at the political convention later that summer. Why? I rang the doorbell. The elderly couple who owned the corner house opened the front door, but not the glass storm door, and were stunned by what they saw. I don't know what their reaction actually was, but I suspected they may have reacted as any seniors would. Cautious, a bit scared, but ultimately concerned enough to get me help. Being a senior myself today, I probably would have reacted the same. In hindsight, I didn't think they could tell if I was an intruder, a young prankster, or someone truly in distress. Those scenarios were all possibilities, I'm sure, in that moment. Thankfully, they realized I was not clowning around, but was in severe distress. They called my parents, an ambulance, and the police, and I was taken to nearby Northwest Hospital within 20 minutes. I spent the night in the emergency room getting stitched up for head wounds. I remember 8 stitches over the right eye. At the time, it appeared I suffered no visible bodily or physical injuries. However, my entire body felt a little bit numb. While no other part of my body was bloodied, nothing more was done to determine if any internal injuries occurred. In hindsight, there probably was nothing more the doctors and nurses at the hospital could have done at that time to more properly diagnose and rule out or confirm internal injuries. However, with today's science and technology, it might have been possible to more aggressively investigate any signs of internal trauma. It might have been even more traumatic night had they done this. But I'll leave that as a topic for my next podcast. Be that as it may, I was in a fog for most of the time while receiving my emergency room treatments. I reflected on the chaos that had erupted on what should have been a peaceful evening the night before. As the sun rose on the following morning, the ambush, I couldn't help but ponder the absurdity and the reality of what had just happened. I was needlessly, shamelessly beaten up the night before. I had no idea of the real consequences that would follow in the immediate months to come. Being at the wrong place at a bad time, Saturday night, June 15, ended with a chance encounter with an older friend of mine who was a distant acquaintance at best. Oddly, I might have even been on the same pickup baseball team with Ricky P. and suspected other assailants on the Steinmetz campus in my earlier boyhood years. However, it ended with a violent confrontation between two groups of Chicago youth who, for a few moments at least, had relived the timeless rivalry of dupers and greasers. It was a night to remember, one that I and my friends would carry through the summer of 1968. Actually, all of us have lived with bits and pieces of that memory ever since. The memory was a bit different for me, though. Most importantly, never could I have imagined in that moment I would still be living with the consequences of that night for the next 55 years, and still counting. Thankfully, yes, thankfully, I am blessed out of my socks to be alive today on this planet. In hindsight, I wonder how a night like June 15, 1968 might have played out differently if it happened to happen in today's climate of youth gangs and violence on Chicago's city streets. Once again, I believe I was lucky to have the outcome that happened that night. But something else happened that night, a night that began a series of physical changes that I would not become fully aware of for another 2 months. You'll have to return to my next podcast, though, to learn more about those details. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little step back into history. Finally, if you have any comments, questions, or other feedback you'd like to share about this podcast, I definitely welcome it. Please visit my podcast survey at fanlist.com/the juice. Let me repeat that, fanlist.com/the juice. Thank you for your time. Signing off for now, cheerfully, Brian Balicki. Have a great day.